The teaching that you're about to hear this morning is part of our year-long campaign that we are calling the Year of Biblical Literacy. You can find out more over on our website at midtownbiblicalliteracy.com, and there you can find reading plans, resources, podcast episodes, all in an effort to help us raise our understanding of the Bible. So with that in mind, enjoy this teaching.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. How are we? Yeah? Good. Happy St. Patrick's Day to you. I am actually a little bit surprised. I did not realize that as a community, we were the type of people who wore so much green on St. Patty's Day. I'm very, very impressed. I'm going to ask that nobody come up and pinch me, all right? Because I am actually wearing green. My socks are green. I can show you after the gathering today. I'm not going to pull my pants up or anything like that while I'm on stage because I think that might be a little bit inappropriate. But speaking of uncovering feet, today we are going to be in Ruth chapter 3. You like that? That was for free. All right. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 3 this morning. And today, so if you want to grab a Bible and turn there, that'd be absolutely fantastic. And Ruth chapter 3 is something of a climactic moment in the story of Ruth. And I'll go ahead and forewarn you a little bit. It's at the very least, a little bit PG-13. So let's buckle up and get ready to enjoy God's word this morning. It's a scene full of suspense and drama, and it's really something of a turning point on which the whole story of Ruth swings. Now, as you're turning there, I want to make sure that we are all brought up to speed on the story thus far, just in case maybe you haven't been with us for the past couple of weeks or have forgotten. But our story opened by introducing us to Ruth, Naomi and Ruth. And when we first meet them, they are in a rather bad spot. They are living in a terrible time, culturally speaking. The days of the judges, when everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. They lived through a physical catastrophe, a 10-plus year-long famine, which honestly, the likes of which we don't really have much of a concept for here in the modern time. And they've also experienced intense personal suffering and loss. Both of their husbands have died, and both of Naomi's sons have died as well. And they are essentially left destitute and despondent. And when it would have made more sense for her to return back to her own people, Ruth, a non-Jew Moabite, expresses unfathomable commitment to Naomi and the God of Israel, Yahweh. Yet Naomi's conclusion in the beginning is that this is the end of their story. That this poverty and destitution is just going to be the final story for them, and they have no hope. Her conclusion is that God has abandoned her. But then we meet Boaz, a worthy man who through his ordinary faithfulness becomes a tool for God's extraordinary faithfulness. His generosity towards Naomi and Ruth serve as a picture of God's never stopping, never giving up, steadfast love. The Hebrew word we talked about was hesed. It's this word that means steadfast love or faithfulness. And God's hesed starts to melt Naomi's hardened heart. And at the end of chapter 2, like we saw last week, she begins to see that their story may not be at an end after all. That God was still there. He was still moving and still providing for his people. And she and Ruth may have a bit of hope that maybe, just maybe, their fortunes can change. Maybe their story can be redeemed and restored. And that's where we pick up in Ruth chapter 3. We'll start in verse 1. This is what it reads. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were?" Now, we're going to need to touch on something here that we brought up last week in chapter 2, because if we don't understand some of what she's saying here, the rest of chapter 3 is going to be even more confusing than it already is, all right? So when she talks about Boaz being a relative of theirs, it's a callback to what she told Ruth in chapter 2, verse 20, where she said, "This man is a relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And this idea of a redeemer is very important. It was a rather unique feature of ancient Hebrew culture, often called the kinsman redeemer or the goel hadam in the Hebrew. And it comes from a few different places in the Torah, but specifically Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 25. And basically what the kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had the privilege and responsibility to act for a family member who was in trouble, in danger, or need. And there were a number of ways this could play out in ancient Hebrew society. If someone was murdered, for instance, the Redeemer would seek out redemptive justice. If someone was sold into slavery, the Redeemer would pay the price to buy them out. If someone sold property or land, the Redeemer would buy it back and regain it for the family. And if a man died childless, the Redeemer would likewise marry the widow and father a son for the dead man as a means of preserving that man's heritage and legacy, as well as providing security and provision for his family. This last one was also known as something called levirate marriage. Now, admittedly, it's a strange system to us, right? Like, this is not how we do things in 21st century America, to be sure. But what we have to remember is that the ancient world was not like our modern one, right? There were no retirement accounts. There were no insurance policies to take care of people in a destitute situation. So this kinsman redeemer is actually an example to us of God's heart to care for, provide for, save, and restore his people, specifically the poor and needy among them. And the point is that Naomi recognizes this is who Boaz could be. This is who Boaz could be for us. He could do more than just be the guy who owns the field that we glean from, but he has the possibility, provision, and position to completely change our future. So she comes up with a plan. Let's look back at verse 2. See, she's talking to Ruth. She says, see, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. So a bit of context, after the harvest, barley would have to go through a process of threshing and winnowing, which was basically this way of separating the good wheat or the good barley from the bad parts. And all barley growers from all the fields had to do this at the end of the season. And while it was work, it was also very celebratory work. It might be helpful to think of it a little bit like payday. So let's say you own a business of some sort. There comes a time where you got to open up the cash register, maybe at the end of the week. You got to open up the cash register and see what profits you made, see what you brought in. It's still work, but if it's been a good week, it's a good type of work. It's a type of work that you look forward to doing. And that's kind of what this was for them. It was work, but it was also this celebration of the harvest that had come in. It was the celebration of all that God had done to provide for them. The workers were getting to see and rejoice in the fruitfulness of the season. And typically the farmers and workers did this together, especially in small places like Bethlehem. So the workers would wind up just basically staying the whole night, sleeping with the grain to prevent it from being stolen. And so the whole thing was basically this kind of like work party situation, where they might have had to stay late at the office, but the good news was the whole staff was there and the boss brought pizza and drinks, that kind of thing. Like it was a fun night, so to speak. And since Naomi knows that Boaz is a barley farmer and a successful one at that, she knows that Boaz is going to be there. And she also knows that since this is happening at the end of the harvest, their time is running out. Their time is running short. The harvest has come in. So the time that Ruth would have to see and be around Boaz in the fields is going away. If they were ever going to have a shot at something more developing, this was going to be it. This was the moment. So she says in verse 3, wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So she essentially tells Ruth, go wash up, go get your hair done, put on some of that smell good and some good clothes, and go to where Boaz is going to be. Now, it's worth noting that she might be saying this because where has Ruth been for the past several months? In the fields. She's been out in the fields working, wearing work clothes for months on end. And for what it's worth, ancient bathing practices were not like what ours are, all right, with all this easy access we have to plumbing and those sorts of things. It's not how it worked in the ancient world. The ancient world was a much more smelly place, if you will, okay? So she might be saying, hey, listen, you've been out working. It's time to get yourself cleaned up and go actually present yourself. But what's interesting is that the Hebrew phrase here is also what is used in 2 Samuel 12:20 when David changes his clothes after a season of mourning. After he's been mourning a loss, this is the phrase that is used to talk about the new clothes he puts on to move on with his life. And so it's actually pretty reasonable to conclude that what Naomi is also telling Ruth here is she's saying, hey, it's time for us to put our mourning behind us. It's time for you to put your mourning behind you. It's time to stop thinking of yourself as just a widow and to actually present yourself once again to be eligible to be married. It's time for us to stop dwelling on our past and actually put some thought and energy into what God may have for us in the future. But don't make yourself known at first. Wait, and when the time is right, then you will approach him. Verse 4. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And this is where it gets a little weird, all right? Like, what is happening? What? Sneak up on him while he's sleeping? Feet stuff? What's going on, right? Like, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the only one who asks these questions, but this seems a little odd. I don't know about you, but if a young woman came up to me and was like, Bailey, I would like to have a husband. Can you tell me how to get one? This is not what I would say. This is not the advice I would give. And it's not the advice I hope you would give either, right? What is going on? What's happening here? This is admittedly strange, all right? And the truth is that it's a little ambiguous. It's a little ambiguous. Generally speaking, there are two perspectives on what Naomi is planning here. There's a TV PG perspective and one that's a little more TVMA, if you will. So there are some who say that Naomi's motives here are pretty illicit. That Naomi is sort of picking up where her previous husband Elimelech left off and what was common in the time of the judges, just doing what seemed right in her own eyes, trying to manipulate the situation by sinful means and take matters into her own hands. So her telling Ruth to dress up is telling her to dress seductively. And this instruction to wait until he's eaten and drank is this encouragement to basically wait till he's a little sauced up and not thinking straight. And this uncovering of feet and lying down, they say it has specific sexual connotations because sometimes in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for feet can refer to a particular male anatomical feature that is not feet, if you will. So they say her plan is for Ruth to basically go and sexually proposition Boaz. Now, I'll tell you that personally, I'm not really convinced by this. Because I think we're meant to see progressive change in Naomi's character throughout the story. But it's still possible that this could be her motive. On the other hand, those in favor of a more TV PG understanding point to the fact that the word used for feet here is not the one that was typically used for that particular euphemism. The Hebrew already had a word for that, and the word being used here isn't it. Likewise, they say that lying down at someone's feet was a known sign of submission that servants showed towards their masters, a physical way of saying, I'm here to do what you say. And so they contend that the clandestine nature of this plan is to avoid suspicion or potential embarrassment for both Ruth and Boaz. And these actions are just a subtle way to startle him awake when he feels the breeze on his feet and enable him to see that Ruth is there. For what it's worth, most biblical scholars think that this is the likely explanation. But I'll also tell you what I think. I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters. I actually think the obscurity is the point. That the author wants us to wrestle with the ambiguous nature of this. I think the author intentionally keeps it ambiguous, intentionally doesn't spell it out because he wants us to feel the tension of this moment. He wants us to see that this, for all sorts of reasons, is a really, really risky move. He wants the audience to wrestle with the question, what's about to happen here? What's about to go down? To feel the risk, to feel the suspense of the moment, that Ruth has been so noble and righteous up to this point. Is there a possibility that her character is about to fail? No matter what Naomi's intentions were, this is an absolutely unthinkably bold move for women in this culture. How is Boaz going to respond? What is Boaz going to do? What's going to happen if somebody sees her? What will they think? What will they say? And it's not just risky in terms of her reputation, but it also opens up Ruth to physical risk too. I mean, she's coming to a man in the cover of night. She could be taken advantage of. I mean, we know that Boaz is an honorable man, but will that honor remain intact when the opportunity for it not to presents itself? Naomi and Ruth seem to believe so, but what could happen? And part of the reason why I think this is the case is because both Ruth and Boaz have histories. As I told you in week 1, Ruth is a Moabite, and according to the Torah, the Moabites were descendants of Lot's daughters who get him drunk one night and sleep with him. And Boaz, likewise, is from the tribe of Judah. And back in Genesis 38, Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar, deceives Judah in order to have a baby. Side note, if you thought that the Bible was just a bunch of nice, clean little moral stories, you haven't read it, okay? Sin and brokenness abound. And I think the vagueness with which the author uses here is intentional to get everyone in the audience to think about these things. Is history going to repeat itself? Will this be another story of tragedy and failure? What's going to happen? Well, let's see. Let's look at verse 5. And she, Ruth, replied, "All that you say, I will do." And the tension builds. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Everything is going according to plan. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And if you've ever been woken up in the middle of the night by a 5-year-old 5 inches from your face, you get this. You understand this response. Like, oh gosh, who are you? What are you doing? What's going on, right? Like, I mean, it'll freak you out. This is Boaz. And here's the thing to note though. At this point, Ruth goes off script. She doesn't wait for him to speak. She doesn't wait for him to tell her what to do. She jumps in and says, and she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Now, it might not sound like it to our 21st century ears, but what's happening here is in these words, Ruth is proposing to Boaz. This statement mimics the words of God in places like Ezekiel, where he describes himself as Israel's husband. And though it might sound strange to us, it would not have sounded strange for the Hebrew audience. She is in no uncertain terms asking for his hand in marriage. And this quite simply did not happen in the ancient world. But what we have to see here is this is a bold move by Ruth. Here is Ruth doing something special, something magnificent. Here is Ruth believing in and pursuing the promises and ways of God. That this provision of a redeemer from the Torah, the one who could rescue and change her story and future, she believes can be hers. She believes these promises of God are for her and Naomi, and she just lays it all out for Boaz. It's also the same language from chapter 2, verse 12, when Boaz prays that God would be her refuge. She is saying, "Boaz, will you be the very thing that you prayed for? Will you be and do the very thing that you asked God to do for me?" And for a moment, I would just like for you to put yourself there, to put yourself in Ruth's shoes, to imagine what must she be thinking and what must she be feeling in these moments? How scary this leap of faith, and let's be clear, that's what it is, how scary this leap of faith must have been. To know that you have come into this clandestine moment completely vulnerable. Reputation, physical safety, and future completely hanging in the balance. But you were willing to risk it all for what God had promised. And so you put yourself at Boaz's feet because you know he's the one shot you've got at changing your story. I don't think it takes a lot of speculation to imagine that Ruth is hanging on a thread here, and that every second until Boaz responds feels like an eternity. Her heart beating, through her chest. What's about to happen? What's he going to say? What's he going to do? Verse 10. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. So here's what Boaz sees. He sees her faith and faithfulness and is blown away by it. He recognizes that this is an ambitious move, that this is a self-denying, faith-filled move that Ruth is making, namely for Naomi. And he calls it kindness, but it's that Hebrew word again that we've mentioned so much through this series. It's that word hesed, that never stopping, never giving up, steadfast love, or rather faithfulness of God. This is what Boaz is seeing. He's saying, I'm older than you. I'm old. And you could have gone after a younger man. That might have been your preference. That might have even been better for you in the long run. But instead, you chose God's path of redemption to care not just for yourself, but for Naomi too. And he recognizes this isn't just a one-time thing that Ruth has displayed, but a pattern. When she committed to Naomi and stayed with her in the first place, she sacrificed her homeland, her easiest path to security. She sacrificed living near her parents and everything that was normal to her. And she did all of that to commit herself to Naomi, and the one true God. And now here in the second act, she's done it again. She's literally put herself at Boaz's feet and asks for his covering and redemption, which on a whole nother level is throwing herself at God's feet, asking him for his covering and redemption as well. But I'll talk about that more in a minute. But she comes potentially risking reputation and safety, sacrificing better or potentially more long-lasting marital prospects, all out of faith in the faithfulness of God and steadfast love for Naomi. Verse 11. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. He says, I will do it, for everyone knows and has seen the type of woman that you are. They have seen your faith and your faithfulness. It's actually the same language from Proverbs 31, which coincidentally in the Hebrew order of the Old Testament precedes Ruth, and I think that's by design, and it describes a woman who has built her life on God. We're meant to see that this is what is taking place here, that the Proverbs 31 woman is Ruth. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight and in the morning. If he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Boaz says there's one glitch in the plan. I am a redeemer, but there's another relative that is closer and therefore first in line to be a redeemer. And like Ruth, what he's saying is let's go about this the right way. Once again, Boaz is showing himself to be a worthy man, doing things the right way. And this is what makes part of this story so amazing, in my opinion, that in a time where compromise was the norm, neither of them is willing to compromise on God's ways. They trust that he will work it out as they follow him. Verse 14. So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize her. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. So Boaz makes sure to protect her reputation. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. She held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. So like in chapter 2, Boaz once again extends unbelievable generosity to her. This time, it's like 120 pounds of barley. I don't know if he gave it to her in a cart to carry or if she's She-Hulking this whole thing. I don't know what's going on, but it's absolutely incredible. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? And you have to keep in mind, Naomi doesn't know what's going on. She has no cell phone. Texting doesn't exist. She's probably been up all night wondering how her plans have fared. Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And so she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And so ends scene 3. And here, in a pivotal and surprising way, Ruth's faith and faithfulness once again is put on vivid display. I've heard faith described as confident expectation or trust. in the promises and person of God. The writer of Hebrews says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is looking at what's in front of you and being able to say, I may not know what's going to happen. I may not know what lies ahead. I may even look crazy or risky to everyone else, but I know who God is. So I'm going to put my life in his hands and trust what he says. I trust him. I trust that he's right. I trust that his word is true and that come what may, he's got me. And it should come as no surprise that these are the things that pop off the pages of this scene with Ruth. This is the theme of Ruth's story: faith and faithfulness, faith and steadfast love. And what I want to do for us this morning is I just want to draw our attention to a few things about them here that I think are vitally important for us as we consider our own faith. And I'm not going to belabor it long because it's already been a long story, but I would just hate for us to miss what we see about Ruth's faith here and how it might also connect to our own. So first, notice in this part of the story how Ruth's faith moves her into action. Do you see that? Her faith moves her into action. Like Naomi may have been the one to concoct the plan, but Ruth moves on it. Why? Because like we've seen all through this story, Ruth believes in the God of Israel. This is how Boaz interprets these events. She believes in God's promises. She believes in God's ways. So she believes that God is after their redemption. So she boldly steps out in faith that he will actually do it, that he will do the thing that he has promised to do. Pastor John Piper calls Ruth's actions here strategic righteousness, and I love that language. His point is that her faith in God emboldens her. It gives her this zeal to take the risk, to make a plan and move. It gives her the gumption, you might say, to do something. And look, she doesn't know how it's all going to turn out. Like you see that too, right? Like she doesn't know how things are going to end. She doesn't know what's going to happen. But what she does know is that Boaz is a redeemer and God wants redeemers to redeem. And the point is that faith in God ought to also move us into action because it confidently trusts in the character and promises of God. That when you confidently trust in the character and promises of God, it changes what you do. When you believe that he is faithful and will do what he says he will do, it changes things about how you do what you do. And this could get drawn out into all kinds of areas of our life. Honestly, like in your parenting, like I don't know how my kids are going to turn out, but I trust that God loves them more than I do. That he loves them more than I do. And so I'm going to move on that, right? If I believe this is how God feels towards my kids, I'm going to move on that. I'm going to do everything in my power, right, to tell them about Jesus. I'm going to study scripture with them. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to pray with them in the confident expectation that God is going to do something. Faith doesn't lead me to just sit back on my laurels and do nothing, but it prompts me to move into action, to say, God, you want this, so we're chasing it. In your career, whether it's going how you want it to go or not, I trust that God's got me. He's got me. That nothing that I do and nothing that he brings into my life is going to be wasted. And that there's purpose for me beyond just the nuts and bolts of my job. So I'm going to move on that, right? I'm going to move on it. Not only am I going to work hard, but I'm going to come into it with a confident expectation that God has something for me here, a person to bless, an opportunity to share the good news of his gospel, something beyond me, because I know this is what God is about. And those are just two, but it's true for everything in your life. Your marriage, you believe God has good for you, so you move. You invest in it. In your neighborhood, you believe God wants to use you, so you move towards your neighbors. In your fight against sin, you believe God has good for you in what he commands, so you move towards righteousness. In fact, I think the clearest way we see this in Ruth's story is that that's the movement she makes as well, that her faith moves her to righteousness. So I told you about that tension that we're meant to feel in this text. Is history going to repeat itself, right? Is Ruth's character going to be compromised? The answer is a resounding no. She doesn't go into this situation and think, well, I really want it to go a certain way, so I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. I'm going to let the ends justify the means, so to speak. No. She interrupts the script and says, this is what I'm here for, and I want it to be done God's way. I'm not trying to trap you in sin. I don't want you to take advantage of the situation. I want you to do the redeeming God's way. This is the hallmark, for what it's worth, of biblical faith. Are you willing to do it God's way when the heat is turned up? When life is uncertain? When it's uncomfortable? Or when the timetable isn't what you want it to be? Or what's even more, when the enticement of sin is present, maybe even overwhelming? When it seems like sin is what would be best and feel best, when it could be hidden under the cover of night, and no one would have to know. In those moments, there is real challenge to trust God. And for Ruth, her faith in God is revealed, so to speak, by her faithfulness to his ways. You see that? You could say that every sin we commit on some level is a failure to trust God. The reason you lie, for instance, is because you don't trust God to handle the outcomes that come with telling the truth. The reason you turn to pills and a bottle and a whole host of other substances to cope with the difficulties of life is because you don't trust God to handle it for you. You don't trust that he could do anything about your pain. The reason you're entertaining thoughts about that affair is because you don't trust God with your marriage, that he is for your good and it is for your good, even when it's hard. The reason you aren't generous but greedy is because you don't trust God with your life. You don't trust him for your security or your comfort or your joy. And this is why the answer to growing in godliness, to becoming the type of people who leave sin behind, isn't try harder and do better. Because that way of living has a shelf life. You can change your behavior for a little while, but to really grow into the type of person God means for us to be, we have to change what we trust. We have to change what has our faith. We have to change what we worship, so to speak. Faith in the biblical sense is not just this mental assent to truth claims about God. Faith in the biblical sense is a whole life thrust onto God, a whole life thrust onto God and his way, completely and totally, that completely reorients everything about us, our loves, our priorities, our lifestyles, our decision-making, because we know who he is and we trust him. That's what actually changes what we do. Which brings me to the last thing to note about Ruth's faith, how her faith is in the right place. To say it a little bit differently, how her faith is in the only thing that can actually change things for her. Here's what I mean. The reason this crazy plan worked, the reason this bold step of faith ended in the promise of provision for Ruth and Naomi is because ultimately, Ruth laid down at the right feet. She laid down at the right feet. There was inherent risk in this plan, right? Lots of things could have gone wrong. If it wasn't Boaz that she laid down in front of, if he wasn't in the position to redeem, if he wasn't worthy, if he wasn't wealthy enough to be able to take on the debt of redemption, because let's be honest, redemption is costly. This plan wouldn't work. This plan works because of who Boaz is. Because when he wakes up in the middle of the night and she says, "Shelter me under your wings," he is the person who could actually do it. And what's more is he is the person worthy of saying these words to. And hopefully you pick up on those breadcrumbs, because when I read this, I can't help but see how this part of the story reflects the reality of the greater story, pointing us forward to the goodness and grace of Jesus, who was God become man so that he could be our kinsman redeemer, that he would be in a position to redeem us, that he is good and worthy, and that he has the power and the wealth and the credit in his account to buy us out of debt. As Ruth lays down at the feet of Boaz, what she's doing is she's laying down the framework for what it means for us to have faith in Jesus. We come to Jesus saying, I am your servant. Cover me. I am yours. Shelter me and put your wings over me. Redeem me. I need you to cover me. Jesus, I need you to shield me. All I can bring to you is my debt and need. That's all I have to offer. And I need you to do the thing that only you have the ability to do, to heal me from my brokenness, to save me from my sin, to restore to me what has been lost and destroyed. All I can bring is a broken story in need of redemption. But he is the one who can redeem. He is the one who can change things. And the good news of the gospel is he does. He does. Through his sacrificial death for sin and his victorious resurrection, anyone who comes to him will not go back empty-handed. Anyone who comes to him will not go back empty-handed. And so this morning, all I really want to do is call us to faith. To a faith that moves us. A faith that moves the ways of God in us. But most important, a faith that is moved to Jesus, to the real hope that we have in him. Romans tells us that everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. That if you come to Christ like Ruth, he has promised to cover you in his wings. And I know that might be a scary proposition for some of us because it feels risky, right? Like there's inherent risk to letting go of what I've been chasing, to letting go of the life that I have grown used to and accustomed to. It means leaving behind everything we currently know and believe and do. It's a risky proposition, but it's one that is worth it. And it's one that we know how God is going to respond. He responds with, yes, I will do it. I have done it. For some of us, you're here and you've said you're a Christian for longer than you can remember, but it hasn't functionally led to any real action or impact in your life. You are invited to consider the nature of your faith this morning. Invited to consider, what is your faith really in? Maybe you're here and you realize that you have been laying down at the wrong feet. Maybe you've looked to romance or finance or family or comfort or substance or fill in the blank with whatever it is. But it's the wrong feet. And you've said, I'll be your servant, cover me, save me, fix my story, but none of them can, and none of them have. None of them could forgive your sin. None of them could pay your debt. None of them ever could seem to send you back full, only more and more empty. The invitation from Ruth 3 this morning is simple. Make a move of faith. Come put your faith, your trust in the character and promises of God. Come lay yourself at the feet of Jesus and let him redeem you. Let him forgive you. Let him change you. And let him make your story, like Ruth's story, something completely and utterly new.